I still remember the harbor that morning. Not just the way it looked, but the way it felt. The sky was the color of wet slate, and the sea, unusually calm, mirrored it with a dull, leaden sheen. It was the kind of stillness that presses against your chest, the kind that tells you, without reason or sound, that something isn't right. We didn't yet have the words for what was coming, but I think, in some quiet way, we already knew. I had woken early, as usual, before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. The cobblestones were still damp from the night air, slick underfoot, and the chill clung to my sleeves as I made my way to the docks. A handful of ships had arrived just before dawn, their sails torn like old parchment, their masts crooked like the limbs of dead trees. They looked wounded, like survivors of a storm, but the skies had been clear for days. That alone should have unsettled us. There were no greetings from the sailors as they disembarked, no bawdy jokes, no curses shouted across the gangplanks, no familiar chaos of a port reawakening. Just silence. Their boots hit the dockwood with a soft, deliberate rhythm, like a funeral procession. Some men limped, others coughed behind trembling hands. One collapsed moments after stepping ashore and was quietly carried away by two others with downcast eyes. Still, we worked. That was what we did. Crates were unloaded, spices, wines, bolts of foreign cloth. And I remember thinking the whole shipment felt wrong. The olives were moldy. The fish stank like they'd been dead for weeks. One crate, smaller than the rest, was packed with what looked like old rags, except they were soaked in something dark and crusted. When the dockmaster pulled one free, he recoiled like he'd touched fire. He claimed it was wine that had gone bad. No one believed him, not even himself. Around midday, the air changed, not just in scent, but in weight. The wind carried a damp, heavy smell that settled into your lungs like wet ash. It mixed with the usual salt and fish, and turned the entire port into a place that felt half dead. Whispers traveled faster than cargo. Some said plague had swept through Messina and Sicily. Others muttered of cursed ships and devils in the hold. A few blamed the stars. Too many eclipses, too many omens ignored. But no matter the story, the conclusion was always the same. The sickness had come ashore. By evening, a priest arrived in full robes, swinging a censer that left trails of gray smoke drifting between the sails. He mumbled blessings over crates, over the ships, over us. A few laughed, others knelt. Most just stared ahead, unmoving. Then came the boy. He had been helping unload a barrel of salted meat, no more than 12 years old. I watched him stagger, just a little, then again, and finally collapse near the fish stalls. His father screamed, though none of us moved to help. We just watched. He lay twitching on the stones, blood leaking from his nose, his lips darkening by the second. When the priest reached him, he only whispered one word: marked. By the time lanterns lit the harbor, 3 more had fallen ill. One had black spots under his arms. Another vomited blood into a pile of straw. The last simply fell and never rose again. Panic didn't explode. It spread like mist, thick, slow, creeping into lungs and thoughts alike. As I left the harbor that night, every step away from the ships felt heavier than the last. Doors were being bolted shut, windows shuttered. Men whispered prayers into the folds of their wives' hair. Children were hushed without reason, and taverns that once spilled laughter into the alleys stood dark and silent. The city, which just that morning had hummed with life, now seemed to listen, to strain, for a sound it feared yet could not name. I glanced back once. The ships sat still, bobbing gently in the water, their tattered flags limp in the breeze. And though I was too far to be sure, I thought I saw someone still on board, standing alone, watching. The plague had not announced itself. It had arrived quietly, wrapped in linen and shadow, carried in lungs and fleas and superstition. And by the time we understood that it had come, it was already too late. The next morning, I was awoken not by the rising sun or the cries of fishmongers, but by the bell. At first, it rang slowly, one solemn toll that echoed through the alleys and open windows like a voice from the dead. Then again, and again, rhythmic, measured, relentless, the kind of sound that seems to have no beginning and no end, as if it had always been there, waiting, and now that it had found its voice, it would never fall silent again. It wasn't the town bell, nor the churches. It came from the monastery on the hill, whose bell tower we rarely heard. That bell was only meant to toll for the dead, and that morning, it did. All day. You might think the sound would eventually blend into the noise of the city, that we'd grow used to it. But you can't grow used to a bell that marks death. Every strike was like a heartbeat that didn't belong to you. A reminder, a warning, a sentence passed. At first, people tried to go about their day. The bakers still lit their ovens. The washerwomen still dragged their pails to the river's edge. But everything felt off. There were fewer voices in the streets, and those who spoke did so quietly, as if afraid to draw the bell's attention. Even the dogs barked less. The pigeons that gathered near the fountain had vanished. The marketplace, usually bursting with color and shouting, felt like a stage left abandoned mid-play. Vendors whispered prices instead of haggling. Coins were dropped, not counted. No one touched anyone unless they had to. And then, as I turned a corner near the chapel, I saw them. 2 monks, draped in rough brown robes, were dragging a cart. A wooden thing, hastily built, its wheels squeaking under the weight of what it carried. The bodies were covered, but only barely. Hands dangled. A foot peeked from under a cloth. And the smell. God help me. The smell hung in the air like something alive, sour and thick. I gagged behind my sleeve, though I'd smelled death before. This was different. This wasn't just rot. It was grief, decay, and the heavy breath of fear itself. One of the monks, older, with eyes that seemed too calm, looked at me as they passed. He didn't speak, just nodded, and I nodded back, as if that meant something. As if we both knew the script of a play neither of us had chosen to perform in. They rang a small handbell as they went, its clinking delicate and oddly innocent. The 2 bells together, one high and thin, one low and booming, formed a kind of music that clawed at your ribs. And that was when I began to notice them. The signs. A red X scrawled on a door in chalk. A bundle of herbs nailed to a lintel. A house with all its windows open wide, as though trying to breathe, trying to exhale the sickness. Another with every shutter nailed tight, as though trying to hold death out by force. The bell never stopped. Even when I went to the bakery, which still dared to stay open, it followed me. Every few minutes, dong. Again, dong. And every time, someone flinched. A child, a mother, a man whose hands shook as he wrapped his bread. Whose turn? I heard someone whisper. Who now? Because that's what the bell had become. A grim metronome marking each soul that had passed from breath to shadow. And though no names were spoken, we all began to guess, to suspect, to imagine. The mind is cruel that way. It fills silence with fear and absence with certainty. That evening, as I walked home through a street littered with overturned barrels and abandoned baskets, I saw a woman standing at her door. She was young, maybe no older than I, and holding a candle in both hands, even though it wasn't yet dark. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused. Behind her, I heard a cough. Wet, ragged, final. She didn't flinch. She just kept standing there, holding that candle like it was the only thing still warm in her world. And all the while, the bell kept ringing. Even when I lay in bed, wrapped in every blanket I owned, its sound reached me. Soft, distant, but inescapable. I pressed my hands over my ears. I tried humming. I even tried prayer. But the rhythm had already nested inside my mind. I dreamt of it. Of bell towers made of bone. Of monks ringing ropes attached to hearts. Of streets paved in ashes, each toll scattering dust. By morning, I no longer heard the bell as separate from myself. It was in my blood, a pulse I couldn't still. And I knew then, without being told, that it would ring again today, and tomorrow, and the day after that, until there was no one left to ring it. The house had never been silent. Even in sleep it breathed. Creaks in the beams, wind against the shutters, the faint shuffle of cloth as someone turned beneath a blanket. But after the second week, the silence became something else. Thicker, heavier. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of fear. I lived alone. A narrow row house near the Taylor Square, with crooked steps and a leaking roof. In better times, I might have been ashamed of its state, but now it was a fortress. Every crack stuffed with linen. Every door latched. Every breath I took, measured and quiet. It was during one of those breathless nights that I first heard it, the scratching. At first, it was faint, like a dry leaf brushing stone. I dismissed it, thinking it was the wind, or perhaps just my own nerves. But then it came again, sharper, persistent, and closer, beneath the floorboards. A rat, I assumed. They were everywhere now. With the streets emptier and the dead left longer than they should be, the rats had multiplied. They scurried along gutters, fought in the alleys, and, when brave, darted over doorsteps like they paid no mind to death. But this one felt different. I couldn't say why. It scratched in a rhythm. 3 short, 1 long, then silence. Again and again. Like it was trying to speak. I moved through the house with a candle, its flame jittering in the still air. My shadow danced across walls that felt too close. The scratching led me to the back room, where I stored the few sacks of grain and stale bread I had left. The room smelled of mildew and dust, and the stale breath of forgotten things. I knelt near the floor and listened. The sound was just below me now, frantic, hungry. And then, a second sound, whimpering. I froze. No rat makes that sound. Against every instinct, I pried up the board. The nails gave way with a groan, and beneath it, I saw the shape of something curled, trembling. It was a child. A boy, maybe 7. Filthy, sunken-eyed, barely clothed. He stared at me, too afraid to speak. I didn't ask how he got there. I didn't need to. His eyes told the story. Doors slammed in his face. Streets too full of bodies. A mother who didn't wake one morning. He had crawled beneath homes, hiding from a world that had stopped making sense. I gave him water, bread. He ate like an animal, choking between bites. When he finished, he fell asleep with his head in my lap, and I let him stay. What else could I do? For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel empty. The silence wasn't as sharp. The breath of the place, though thin, had returned. But the scratching never stopped. Now it came from new places, behind the walls, above the ceiling. I would lie awake, the boy curled beside me, and listen to it crawl around us. Not one rat. Many. Dozens. Maybe more. Each scratch a clawed whisper. We're here. We're waiting. One morning, I woke to find the boy burning with fever. His lips cracked, his skin blotched with purple. He looked at me with eyes that no longer saw. I didn't weep. I couldn't. There was nothing left in me to spill. I wrapped him in my only blanket, not out of warmth, but out of shame. Then I carried him to the door, placed him gently outside, and shut it. The scratching stopped. For hours, the house was silent again. I sat in that back room, staring at the open floorboard, the hole that had once hidden a child. The wind pressed at the walls. My candle guttered. And still, I did not move. By evening, the scratching returned. But this time, I understood it for what it was. Not rats. Not fear. Just the sound of death, patiently knocking, one splinter at a time. It began with a knock. Not the kind of knock that startles or alarms, but a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. Then silence. I held my breath and waited. Another 3 knocks, softer this time. Then footsteps. Not hurried, not searching. Just certain. Measured. Like the steps of someone who knows that door's open when they must. When I finally dared to look through the sliver in the shutter, I saw them. 3 figures. Tall. Silent. Dressed in cloaks so black they seemed to drink the daylight. Their hoods hung low, shadows obscuring their faces. They stood still as statues, but somehow they filled the entire street. One of them held a paintbrush, not the kind for art, but the thick, coarse kind used for barns and barrels. The other gripped a wooden pail filled with red, and on my neighbor's door, they painted it. A single, thick crimson cross. It dripped. Not artistically, not beautifully. Just fat streaks of red sliding down warped wood like blood from an old wound. No one came to the door. No one argued. No one protested. Because everyone knew what it meant. The black cloaks didn't speak. They didn't knock again. They simply turned and moved on, the bucket sloshing, the brush swinging slightly. And I watched as they went from house to house, never skipping a step, never showing a face, painting crosses. And it wasn't just homes anymore. Shops, barns, even the doors of churches. By nightfall, my street looked like a battlefield after the arrows had landed. Dozens of doors marked, some fresh, some already faded, as if even the paint couldn't cling to death for long. I lit no candle that night. I made no sound. The fire stayed cold, and I ate bread so hard it splintered in my mouth. Every creak made me flinch. Every gust of wind felt like it carried whispers. And still, I waited for them to return. In the morning, I stepped outside. Just once. Just to see. The street was quiet, but the signs were there. A trail of powder, white and acrid, had been sprinkled along the thresholds of several marked homes. Lime, some said. To purify. To keep the pestilence from crawling further. It didn't work. I passed by one house where the door stood wide open. Inside, it was empty. Not swept, not cleaned. Just emptied. A table overturned, a chair broken, and on the floor a pair of shoes, still neatly side by side, as if someone had simply stepped out of them and disappeared. From behind me, a voice whispered, "They took them last night." I turned. It was a woman I didn't recognize. Her eyes were hollow. Her hands clutched a rosary, the beads worn nearly smooth. "Took who?" I asked, though I already knew. The whole family. The black cloaks came with carts. They didn't speak, just pointed, the sick, and the rest followed. Where? She didn't answer, just looked down and murmured something I couldn't catch. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into a doorway. I returned home and bolted the door. I waited for the knocks. They never came, not that day. But by evening, I found the cross anyway, painted not on the door, but on the wall beside it. Hasty, tilted, as though whoever had marked it had run out of time or nerve. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if I should wash it off. But no one ever did. It wasn't just paint. It was a verdict. From that moment on, the house changed. It was no longer mine. It belonged to the sickness now, to the silence, to the scratching beneath the floorboards and the whispers in the corners. I moved through the rooms like a ghost already claimed. I avoided mirrors. I avoided my own reflection. Because when you see that red cross on your door, you start to wonder if you're already gone, if maybe you died days ago and no one told you yet. That night, I dreamed of cloaks, not men beneath them, just the cloaks themselves, floating, painting, marking. I dreamed of a brush dragging itself across my skin, drawing red lines I couldn't see but could feel burning. And always, always, the sound of footsteps outside my door, waiting. They say death has many faces. Some speak of a pale woman in the fog, others, a cloaked man with a scythe. But for me, death wore a beaked mask, black gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat. Death smelled faintly of vinegar and roses, and it knocked at my door just after dawn. I hadn't slept. The red cross on my wall still glistened like wet blood, even though it had dried. I kept waiting for the return of the black cloaks, but instead, I heard a slow, deliberate tapping. Not on the door, but against the wood of the window frame. Not urgent, not threatening, just precise. Like someone announcing themselves to the ghosts inside. When I opened the shutter just a crack, he was already staring. Or at least, the mask was. A long, curved beak jutted forward like a bird ready to peck through the soul. 2 round glass lenses shimmered in the pale morning light. The hat sat low, casting a crescent of shadow over the mask. He stood utterly still, one hand behind his back, the other clutching a leather satchel. I didn't speak. I didn't move. Eventually, I unlatched the door. The doctor entered without a word. He didn't ask permission. He didn't glance around. It was as though he already knew the house, had mapped it in some dream or cursed archive. Each step he took echoed like judgment. He set the satchel down on the table and opened it with slow mechanical care. Inside were tools that didn't look like they belonged to a physician. Long hooks, glass vials with clotted remnants, a twisted metal spoon. Everything glinted cold and distant. He finally turned toward me. His voice was muffled, but it crept out like smoke through the beak. "Anyone ill in the house?" I swallowed. "Number, I'm alone." He paused as if weighing the lie. Then he nodded once, as if the answer didn't matter. He moved from room to room, not searching, but inspecting, as if disease left behind a scent only he could detect. When he passed by the blanket chest where the boy had once slept, he stopped. He bent down, gloved fingers grazing the wood. "Someone else was here," he said quietly. I didn't answer. He stood slowly, turned to me, and extended a vial. "Drink this." The liquid inside was cloudy, pale green. It smelled of thyme, vinegar, and iron. I hesitated. "It will do nothing," he said before I could even ask. "But it's what I'm told to give." I drank. It burned. Not with heat, but with the memory of bitterness. My stomach clenched, and I held my breath to keep it down. The doctor stepped closer. For a moment, I could see my own reflection in the glass of his mask, my eyes wide, sunken, my face hollow. I looked like someone already mourned. "Have you seen black swellings?" he asked. "Under the arms? Between the legs?" "No." "Do you cough blood?" "No." "Do you hear voices?" I paused. "Yes," I whispered, "but I think they're mine." He stood still. I could hear his breath, slow, measured, controlled behind the herbs stuffed inside that beak. I had heard the mask was packed with lavender and mint, meant to protect them from the miasma. But nothing could protect anyone now. He returned to the satchel, pulled out a roll of parchment, and unrolled it. A long list of names, with some crossed out in red, some underlined, others smudged beyond recognition. He added mine. No cross, no note, just my name. Then he folded it and tucked it away. Without another word, he left the house. I didn't follow. I didn't watch him go. I sat at the table and stared at the space he had occupied, where the scent still lingered. Sweet, acrid, final. That night, I dreamed of birds. Dozens of them. Huge, black-beaked, their wings made of parchment and ash. They circled above me in a sky that flickered like firelight. And each time one dipped low, I felt a breeze pass over me, like the whisper of fever. When I woke, the house was quiet again, but the glass where he had touched it was fogged, and outside, the red cross had begun to fade, as if death had passed by, but hadn't left. The bells were the first sign that something had changed. Not the church bells, not those noble, solemn sounds that marked the hours or called for prayer. No, these were different. They were smaller, faster, carried on leather straps and shaken with purpose. The kind of bells you wear when death walks behind you and you want the world to hear it coming. They rang through the alleyways like warnings. Ting, ting, ting. Ting, ting, ting. Not musical, not rhythmic, just frantic. And behind them came the carts. I remember the first one I saw. It wasn't even a cart, really. Just a broken wheelbarrow patched together with rope and rusted nails. But it groaned beneath the weight of what it carried. A shape under a blanket. Then another. Then another. One man pushed, his shirt soaked through with sweat, and a woman behind him walked slowly, ringing that cursed bell with every other step. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just rang the bell and looked ahead. No one watched from their windows anymore. Curtains stayed drawn. Doors stayed shut. The bell was permission enough. The carts didn't stop. They passed through the streets like funeral processions without mourners. The men who pulled them didn't wear black. They wore whatever rags they could find. And their faces were tired. Not from grief, but from the sheer weight of it all. You could see in their eyes that the world had ended weeks ago, and they were just helping tidy up the pieces. There were no priests, no last rites, no graves, only pits. Huge open pits dug on the edge of the city, where the carts were wheeled and tilted, their burdens dumped into darkness without names or prayers. Some pits were covered with lime, others just with dirt, sometimes not even that. And when the carts returned, they were lighter, but the air around them was heavier. I began to time my days around the bells. You could hear them from blocks away, echoing between stone walls and wooden beams. I learned to count the rings between turns, between drops. I don't know why. Maybe it gave me a sense of order. Maybe I was trying to predict when my house would be next. Then came the smoke. At first it was distant, gray trails curling up from behind roofs, rising into the pale sky like questions with no answers. But soon it was everywhere, not from burning homes, but from the carts themselves. People had started to burn the bodies. They said it was safer. That fire cleansed what lime could not. That ash did not carry the plague. So the carts came, and when the pits filled, they set fire to the bodies where they lay. Sometimes they did it right in the middle of the street. And I watched. From my window, I saw a man strike a torch and toss it onto a heap of rags and limbs. It caught slowly at first, then with a roar. The smoke was black. The smell, bitter and sweet, coated my tongue, even from indoors. Someone covered the bodies with herbs, rosemary, juniper, lavender. A hopeless kindness. The bell never stopped ringing. Even as the flames rose, even as people turned their faces and wept, the bell rang on, steady, relentless. Later that night, I saw a child chasing the sound. Barefoot, wild-eyed, she followed a man with a cart, laughing and mimicking the bell with a rock in a tin cup. He didn't notice, or didn't care. I wondered if she had parents, or if they were already ash beneath the stones. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The light of the fires danced on my ceiling, flickering like the shadows of souls trying to escape. The air was hot, dry, filled with ash so fine it slipped through the cracks in the wood. I covered my mouth with a cloth. I sprinkled vinegar on the floors. I hung garlic from the doorframe. All the old tricks. They didn't work. That night, I dreamed I was in a cart. Not dead, just lying still, listening. I could hear the wheels creak. I could smell the fire before I saw it. But I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, to jump. But I just lay there, still, waiting. When I woke, I checked the walls for a new cross. There wasn't one, but the sound of the bell still rang in my ears. Some say that when a house is truly old, it begins to remember. Its beams hold memories. Its bricks carry voices. The floors creak not from age, but from stories pressing upward, desperate to be told. And in the weeks that followed the doctor's visit, I began to hear the whispers. They started faint, like the sound of wind threading through a gap in the shutters. I told myself it would nothing. Just breeze, rats, the echo of footsteps from the alley below. But the sounds kept returning, always at the same time, just after midnight, when even the fires outside had burned to embers. It was the walls. I'd sit at the edge of my cot, blanket clutched to my chest, and listen. Soft murmurs, indistinct, neither male nor female, neither old nor young, just breath and shape, words unformed yet deliberate, like the house itself was trying to speak. I pressed my ear to the stone one night. The cold bit me first, then the pulse, soft, rhythmic. Not mine, not human. It was like the wall was breathing, and beneath the pulse, I heard it, fragments of words. They took her. The red door. Don't open. I recoiled, heart pounding. I hadn't spoken to another soul in days. Not since the neighbor boy was taken. Not since the carts began burning instead of collecting. I knew madness was a companion in plague. I just didn't think it'd knock so politely before entering. I started talking back, at first to test myself, to anchor reality. I'd ask the walls what they wanted, who they were, what they'd seen. No answers came, until they did. One night, in the stillness, I whispered, "Are you listening?" The reply was slow, drawn out. It slid along the stones like damp ivy. Yes. I sat frozen, mouth dry, lungs refusing to breathe. The voice wasn't inside my head. It wasn't memory. It came from the cracks, from the mortar. "Who are you?" I asked. "We are what remains." I should have fled, should have run barefoot into the ash-choked streets, but I stayed, because deep down, I wasn't afraid of the voices. I was afraid they were the only ones left. The days became gray stretches of silence, broken only by bells and flames. But the nights became alive. I would lie on the floor, pressing my palm to the cool stone, and ask questions. Sometimes the walls answered, sometimes they didn't. But I always listened. They told me of others who'd lived here. A woman who sang to her infant as fever took her. A man who bricked up his own door to keep the pestilence out, and died anyway. A child who kept a journal under the floorboards, pages now eaten by rats. Each voice was a thread, pulling me deeper into the fabric of the house. I stopped opening the windows. I stopped checking the door. I stayed in the darkest rooms, where the whispers were clearest. I knew it wasn't healthy. I knew I was fraying. But the world outside offered only fire and death. The voices offered memory. One night, they told me a name. "Elias," they said, over and over. "Elias, Elias." I didn't know him. Or perhaps I did. The voice that spoke his name trembled, as if calling through time. And then the wall cracked, a hairline fracture across the stone, barely wider than a finger. Dust spilled from it like breath. I reached out. My hand touched something soft. Not flesh, not cloth, but something in between. It pulsed once, then was gone. I screamed, but no sound came out. I curled against the far wall, eyes wide, heart hammering. The crack had vanished. The dust had settled. And the whispering stopped. For days after, there was nothing. Not a sound. Not a dream. The house felt hollow, as if I had broken some unspoken pact. I missed them. I missed the voices. And then, on the 7th night, they returned. Faint at first, then clearer. "Don't be afraid," they said. "We only want to be remembered." It was on a morning choked with fog that I saw the man in black standing alone in the square. I thought he was a statue at first, so still, so sharp against the pale sky. He wore the robes of a priest, or something close to it. Long, soot-colored, with wide sleeves and a hood that draped just above his brow. His face was hidden behind a bird's beak, not the smooth wood of a mask, but something older. Leather, cracked, worn from sweat and years of sun. He carried a staff, topped not with a cross, but with a bone. I had ventured out that morning against my better judgment. My food was nearly gone, and the dried beans had begun to mold. I wrapped my scarf 3 times over my nose, soaked the cloth in vinegar, and stepped into the still, ash-laced air. And there he was. No carts moved, no bells rang, no fires burned. Just the man in the center of the square, like a shadow waiting to be noticed. I stood there, maybe 10 paces away, frozen by the sight of him. Then he turned. Slowly, like a sundial measuring doom, he turned to face me. His beak glinted dull silver in the light. From beneath it came a rasping voice, not loud, but piercing, like dry leaves dragged across stone. "You've seen the fires," he said. "The bells, the burning carts." I didn't answer. "There is no cure," he said. "No sanctuary. No salvation from the breath of death." He stepped closer. The crowd of onlookers, if there had ever been one, was gone. It was just us now. Me and the sermon. He lifted a hand and pointed to the rooftops. A line of crows had gathered, watching. Silent, still. "They see all," he said. "The crows are the record keepers. the judges of flesh. He raised his staff. The bone at the top gleamed, freshly polished. Perhaps human, perhaps not. When the last candle goes out, the crows will decide who is remembered. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the morning cold. You still cling to garlic and prayers, to lime and flowers, but none of it matters. He hissed. The air is poisoned, the soul infected. Then, as if on cue, a crow fluttered down and landed on the staff. It stared at me, cocking its head as if amused. I wanted to run, to scream, to believe this was a nightmare brought on by hunger and grief. But the man stepped back, spread his arms, and began to speak in a tongue I didn't know. The language was harsh, full of guttural sounds and sharp breaks, the kind you might hear carved into tombs or scratched beneath ancient doors. The crows answered. One by one, they cawed and flapped, rising from the rooftops, circling above. Not chaotically, but with eerie coordination, as if rehearsed. The man's voice rose. The fog swirled. The square darkened. And then he stopped. He lowered his arms. The crows landed once more. He looked at me with the patience of death. You still breathe, he said. So you still suffer. That is your gift. That is your punishment. He turned, staff tapping softly on the stones, and walked away. I didn't follow. I couldn't. My legs were lead, my mouth dry, my mind ringing with the sound of 100 wings and one final sentence. When the last candle goes out, the crows will decide who is remembered. I returned home, shaking, closed every shutter, blocked every crack. And that night, I lit a candle, just one, and stared at the flame for hours, afraid of what might happen when it finally died. The door creaked before I even touched it, as if it had been waiting for me, as if the house itself had drawn breath in anticipation of my arrival. I stood before it for what must have been 10 minutes, staring at the warped wood and rusted latch, wondering what had brought me to this place. They called it the pest house. No one did so aloud, of course. They whispered it, spat the name like a curse. It was a place reserved for those already touched by the plague, a place of final days, final breaths, and forgotten names. The city had dozens of them, hidden in alleys, tucked behind crumbling chapels, or nestled beside the river like tumors of despair. But this one was mine. I had seen the black boil rising on my thigh 3 days before. It pulsed like a secret. I tried to ignore it, like a child pretending not to see the monster under the bed. But the fever followed quickly, and the chills came next. That coldness that starts in the bones and refuses to leave, no matter how many blankets you bury yourself beneath. So I came here. Not because I wanted to die, but because I didn't want to be seen dying. Not by neighbors. Not by the boy who once sold me figs. Not by the girl who used to braid lavender into her mother's hair. I didn't want their pity. Or their fear. I opened the door. The smell was immediate. Sour linens, spoiled breath, iron and rot. A sweetness underneath it all. Sickly and wrong. The kind of sweetness that clings to corpses. The kind that tries to pretend it's something beautiful, but only makes the ugliness worse. There were no candles, just daylight leaking through boards like broken promises. Dust hung in the air in thick ribbons, catching the weak sun like silk spun from ghosts. The room was not empty. They were there. 6 of them, maybe 7. It was hard to tell. Shadows curled around their beds like blankets. Some were still. Others moved. Small, shivering motions. A twitch of a finger, a cough that sounded more like a whisper, a moan that slipped between teeth clenched in agony. No one looked up. I took the bed nearest the wall. Its straw mattress crackled as I sat, brittle with time and filth. There was a basin beside it, half full of something that might have once been water. A cloth, stiff and dark, draped over the edge. I laid down, not because I was tired, but because I didn't know what else to do. The hours that followed were slow. Not minutes, not moments, just long stretches of nothingness interrupted by pain. The fever came in waves. I would sweat until my sheets soaked through, then shiver so violently my teeth cracked, my lips blistered, my hands ached from clenching. No one spoke. We communicated in coughs and gasps, in the rattle of bowls, in the creak of wood as someone turned to face the wall and never turned back. A man died the second night. I think he was the one closest to the door. I never saw his face, just his outline. One moment breathing, the next still. When the caretaker came, she didn't weep. She didn't cross herself. She just covered him with a sheet and dragged the body out by its ankles. The sound it made, skin over stone, heels scraping. It still echoes in my head. I counted my breaths, one by one. Inhale, exhale, try again. Sometimes I heard footsteps outside, people passing, not stopping, not knocking, just pretending this house wasn't here. I began to hallucinate. I saw my mother's hands dipping cloth into cool water. I saw the alley where I learned to climb crates and steal apples. I saw a crow perched on my chest, staring into my eyes as if weighing my soul. And then, I woke up. Still alive. Not better, but not dead. That was the worst part. Not the dying, but the waiting. The cruel joke of survival, stretched over days that never ended, inside a house built to contain the dying. The pest house never slept. It hummed with fever. It wept in silence. And I, still breathing, still cursed, lay there and waited for the last breath, for the next knock at the door, for the soft scrape of heels being dragged across stone. I found him at the edge of town, where the stone paths gave way to soil, and the stench of death softened, if only slightly, beneath the breeze that carried the scent of pine and ash. His shop looked forgotten, like it had been swallowed whole by ivy and neglect, a lopsided cottage with windows too small for spying and a door too stubborn to swing wide. And yet, when I knocked, he answered, the candle maker, not the man I expected, not hunched or hooded, not cloaked in gloom. He was young, maybe 30, with pale fingers stained yellow at the tips and eyes that looked like they'd seen the sun for the first time in years. He wore no mask, no gloves, no talisman around his neck. "You're not from here," he said, his voice low, like bees trapped in wax. "I'm not from anywhere anymore," I replied. He stared at me for a moment longer than comfort allowed, then stepped aside and let me in. The air inside was warm, not pleasant, not fresh, but rich with scent. Melted tallow, lavender, rosemary, burnt sage. Candles lined every surface. Hundreds of them, fat and thin, white and blood red, twisted and carved and plain. Some stood tall like guards. Others lay in shallow bowls like sleeping cats. All of them burned with steady flames that never flickered. "How do they stay lit?" I asked. "They're not meant to go out," he said. "That's the point." He led me to a table in the back, where a dozen candles stood in a perfect ring. In the center sat a bowl of something dark and thick, pitch or ink, or maybe something worse. It smelled like secrets and sorrow. "I don't sell these," he said. "I offer them." "For what?" I asked. For remembrance, he said. For names that might otherwise vanish? I didn't speak. He dipped a thin stick into the bowl, then lit one of the candles at the ring. As the flame caught, I saw something strange. The smoke rose, curled, and twisted, forming the shape of a face. A woman. Eyes closed, lips parted. Then it was gone. Your mother? I asked. My sister, he said. She died in the first wave, before the bells stopped ringing. I watched as he lit another candle, another wisp of smoke, another face. Does it help? I asked. No, he said, but it makes the forgetting slower. He turned to me then, candlelight dancing across his cheekbones. Would you like to make one? I nodded. He handed me a stick and gestured to the bowl. Say their name, then dip. My hand trembled. I thought of my brother, the way he used to carve birds from scraps of wood, the way he hummed when he worked, the way he looked at me, even at the end, as if I might still save him. Mate, I whispered. I dipped the stick, lit the candle, and there he was. For a breath, for a blink, in the smoke. I almost fell to my knees. The candlemaker placed a hand on my shoulder. Now he's remembered, he said, for as long as the flame burns. But what happens when it dies? I asked. He didn't answer, because we both knew. Even memory has a limit. I stayed that night, slept beside the warmth of those quiet flames, lulled by the slow drip of wax and the faint hum of something holy. And when I left in the morning, the candlemaker gave me one of his own, small, white, wrapped in linen. For your last night, he said. I didn't ask how he knew. I just nodded and walked away, clutching the candle like a promise that for one more night, maybe two, I wouldn't be forgotten. The sky was gray when I arrived. Not storm gray or dusk gray, just dull, tired, as if even the heavens had grown weary of looking down upon the world. I stood before the old chapel for a long while, unsure if I should enter, unsure if anyone still did. The wooden doors bore no markings, no welcome. One leaned slightly inward, half open, as if pushed by a hand too weak to finish the gesture. I stepped inside. Dust welcomed me first, rising in clouds as my feet disturbed the silence. The pews were empty, not just vacant, but hollow, as though the wood had forgotten the weight of human sorrow. Cobwebs stretched like forgotten hymns from beam to beam. Candles stood unlit. The altar, once pristine, was stained with wax and the faint outline of dried petals that had long since withered. No priest waited. No voices rose in prayer. Only the echo of my own breath reminded me I was still among the living. I walked down the center aisle, each footstep soft and uncertain. A bird's feather lay on one bench beside a torn scrap of linen. I imagined it had once been a child's shawl. Perhaps a mother knelt here not long ago, clinging to hope, pleading for a mercy that never came. The plague had taken the congregation. That much was clear. What surprised me more was that no one had taken their place. Not even the desperate. Not even the guilty. The faith, it seemed, had fled too. I sat on the front pew and tried to remember the prayers I had once known. Words whispered to me by my grandmother beside smoky hearths and flickering oil lamps. Her voice had always trembled on the names of saints, as if she knew even then how fragile their power could be. I tried to pray, but nothing came. Instead, I looked at the cracked walls, the faded frescoes of angels who no longer watched, and I waited. For what? I couldn't say. A sound startled me. Not a voice, just the groan of wood, the kind of sound that buildings make when they're old. or lonely. And then, another sound. Footsteps, slow, dragging. A man emerged from the shadows near the side chapel, tall, cloaked, face covered in gauze. His eyes glinted beneath the hood, but they showed no recognition. Only exhaustion. He walked past me, not stopping, not blessing, just moved toward the altar and knelt and began to cry. I didn't ask why. I knew why. We shared it, that grief, that hollow in the chest where the names of the dead echo like wind in an abandoned house. After some time, he rose, walked to a niche behind the altar, lit a single candle. It flickered for a moment, then steadied, and then he left, never speaking, never looking back. I followed his example, moved to the candle, watched the flame. It danced, golden and small, yet so certain. I closed my eyes and imagined it lighting the way home for the souls we had lost, a lighthouse in the sea of rot and ruin. For a while, I stayed. Let the silence surround me. Let the stillness become my prayer. Then, as the cold returned to my fingers, I stood, bowed my head once, and walked out into the pale daylight. The church did not bless me, but it had held me. And in these times, that was enough. The sun had long abandoned the alleyways, retreating behind the soot-stained rooftops and chimney smoke that never truly cleared. I followed the scent before I saw him, a mix of oil, blood, and fur that clung to the walls like damp wallpaper. The rat catcher lived between two burnout bakeries in a hovel barely taller than a man. No sign hung above the door. He didn't need one. Everyone knew where he was. I entered without knocking. The door creaked like an injured animal, and the moment I stepped inside, I regretted it. Cages. Dozens of them. Stacked, rusted, half broken. Each one home to something squirming, hissing, or squeaking. Not just rats, though there were plenty of those, but ferrets, weasels, even a cat missing one eye. The man sat in the center, thin, wiry, draped in brown leathers, stitched with rat tails and tiny bones. His beard was a tangled nest, and his eyes were yellowed at the edges. Not from age, but from living too long without blinking. "You look too clean," he said without turning. "Not from here." "No one's from here anymore," I replied. He chuckled, a sound like tearing parchment. "What do you want?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure. Perhaps shelter, perhaps information, perhaps something darker. "I need to understand," I said, "why the rats don't die." He turned to me slowly. "They do, just not fast enough." I moved closer. "But the plague? It's in them, isn't it? Or on them? People blame them?" He grinned, revealing more gaps than teeth. "People blame what they can see. The rats, the fleas, the filth. But death has no loyalty. It doesn't need a carrier, just a crack to crawl through." He reached down and pulled out a cloth bundle, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a rat, limp, dark-furred, with a collar around its neck made of twine. "This one's named Bishop," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You name them?" He nodded. "Each one gives me power over them." "What power?" He stood now, taller than I expected. From a shelf behind him, he took a small vial, green glass, stoppered with wax. Inside, something swirled like ink in water. "This is plague," he said. "Distilled." I recoiled. He laughed again. "Don't worry. It doesn't bite unless you ask it to." He uncorked the bottle and dabbed a tiny drop onto a cloth. Then, with a gentleness that startled me, he wiped it on Bishop's back. The rat twitched, sniffed, squeaked, then nothing. "He'll live," the rat catcher said. "He's survived worse. But if you gave that to a man..." He'd rot in hours. I stared at the vial. Why would you keep that? Why do priests keep bones? He replied. Why do kings keep crowns? Because power isn't in what saves us. It's in what we fear. He handed me the cloth. You want to survive? Take it. Wipe your door with it. The plague will pass over you. Maybe. I didn't move. You don't believe me, he said. I believe you, I said. That's why I won't touch it. He shrugged. Suit yourself. But remember this. Plague isn't just a sickness. It's a choice. How we treat it. How we treat each other. He returned the vial to its shelf, wrapped Bishop in his cloth again, and sat down. You'll see more, he said. Worse than me. Worse than death. Be ready. I stepped back out into the alley. The air felt colder now. He didn't follow, just sat in his cage of vermin and riddles. The rat catcher, the madman, the prophet, whatever he wasn't wrong. And I was starting to wonder if anyone truly walked away from this world clean. It was a bell that brought it all to an end, or rather, the absence of one. For weeks, even months, every hour had been marked by its sound, a hollow clang echoing over rooftops and alleyways, reminding the living that time still moved, even as the world stood still. It told for the dead, for the dying, and for those left behind to listen. It was the heart of the city, steady, relentless, comforting in its dread, and then silence. I noticed it in the early morning, when the sky was barely brushing against light, and the mist clung to my skin like grief. I had risen out of habit, not hope. The bell was always first, like the whisper of a priest at your bedside, like the creak of a coffin lid. But this morning, there was nothing. Just wind. Just the flap of torn banners and the rustle of trees no one had watered. I walked through the streets empty now, more ghost than path. Every doorway a question. Every window a warning. The marketplace had become a garden of rot. The bread stalls bore only flies. Fruit had gone soft and black in the sun. A dog gnawed the edge of a wheelbarrow, looking up at me with eyes that had seen too much. I passed the apothecary's, the smithy, the dye seller's shop. All abandoned. The air carried a new scent, not death, but stillness. The kind that follows it. The kind that tells you you're the last one awake. When I reached the church square, I expected the usual gathering. Mourners in black, priests with masks, children staring blankly at the ground. But there was no one. Just the bell tower. Tall, motionless, and still. I climbed it slowly, step by aching step. Each stair moaned under my weight, as if resenting the reminder of a human touch. I half expected to find the bell ringer there, collapsed or praying, or both. But there was no one, only dust and a rope and the great bell itself, tarnished, waiting. I touched it, cold. It hadn't been rung, it hadn't broken, it had simply been forgotten, and that terrified me more than anything, because it meant the city had moved past morning. There was no one left to ring it. I stood beside it for a long time, watched the wind push at the shutters, watched the sun rise through cracks in the wood. And then I pulled the rope. The bell cried out, low, wounded, beautiful. Its voice rolled across the rooftops, through the empty stalls, over the shuttered homes. A final benediction, a cry for remembrance. And I imagined, for just a moment, that someone else heard it, that another soul lifted their head, that in some other part of the city a light flickered. A hand reached for bread. A name was whispered. The sound faded, and with it, the last of something ancient, the rhythm of a city that had loved and lost, and kept breathing anyway. I descended, not as I had come, not with dread, but with a kind of reverence. The bell had not tolled because it had no reason, but now it had. And maybe that was enough. Maybe remembering was survival too.